Our scripture lesson comes to us from the book of Job, chapter 38. One of the things that we often think about in the book of Job is that his journey and all that he had lost. And the book actually is written as a play. It's written to be performed as a play, and it is in the context of a trial that it's lived out. And so Job makes his case, and prosecutors make their case, and then it's time for the judge, God, to speak. And here are the words. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is it that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, and I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you must know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what are its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstones when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouting for joy? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds so that a flood of water may cover you? Can you send forth lightning so that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the inner parts or given understanding to the mind? Who has the wisdom to number the clouds? And who can tilt the water skins of the heavens and what the dust runs into a mass, and the clods it clings together? Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? Can they crouch in their den, or lie in wait in their covert? Who provides for the raven its prey, when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. That song's written by John Fulbright, who lives in Okemah, and the album it's on is one he was nominated for a Grammy a couple of years ago in Americana. Lost out to Bonnie Raitt. I love Bonnie Raitt, but I was actually rooting for him that year. And I remember when I first heard this song, how clear it stood out in relationship to the words from Job, where God speaks out and speaks to Job in such clear terms that Job is coming with his complaints. And who could blame Job? Because he's gone through so much. He's suffered so much. And yet God stands out and says, who are you to question me? And I think sometimes we find ourselves in the place where we become so consumed with ourselves. We can only see our world, and we can't see the bigger picture. And that's what the sermon is about today. Before we get too far into that, we should all thank Gary for us having water in the church this morning. Last night I was driving by on Iowa, and water was flooding up on both sides of Iowa and along the curb, and he was one of the ones in our city crew who got out there and got it fixed last night. And he told me this morning that we woke him up so that he had to come out and can fix it, but he got it all fixed for us. So we're thankful. Also, probably, maybe, because when you do that, sometimes a little mud gets into the line. The water may be a little colored right now, so you may see that also. But anyhow, let's get into the sermon. This scripture reminds us, God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? When I created the sun and the moon and the stars, where were you when all of that was done? And we remember that this God who we worship is the creator of all that is, the creator of the universe, the very ground of our being, from which nothing else we are entirely connected and live our lives. And in the literature of the Old Testament, we need to kind of understand the place and the role that Job fits in. We have the law, the first 5 books. They're not all books of law, but they're called law because those are the books that are traditionally ascribed to Moses. And those 5 books are what's passed on to us of the law. And then we have the prophets, which are the writings. Even though they're not all about prophets, they're the writings that take us through the history of the people of Israel. And then the prophetic writings as well. And then a last group that is kind of all the other writings together, including the Psalms, and a part that we call wisdom literature. And in the wisdom literature, we have the teachings of Proverbs. And Proverbs is very clear how it's approached. It approaches life that basically what we do in our lives, how we live our life, will determine how our life rolls out. To the one who is righteous, to the one who lives rightly, then life will be good. And to those who do what's wrong and what's evil, then they will suffer because of that. And much of life works that way. When legal systems work the way they're supposed to, that's how it happens. Whenever bad guys are caught, brought to trial, put into prison, then that's how it is. But not all of life works out that way. And what's even more clear is that sometimes in our life, it can seem incredibly unfair that those who are good, that those who do the right things, suffer such loss in their life. It was written, the book of Job, this play that was meant to be performed and to be watched. And if you ever get an opportunity, because there are a few people who have actually set it out as a play and you can see it performed, you ought to go do it because it really is fabulous. But it's set out to correct a basic truth. And the problem is, most things in life are true except when they are not. And that's how it is, because generally, if you're good and you do the right things, that comes back and it works out well in life. And if you don't do the right things, you're always doing the wrong things, it comes back. But not always, not always. And so we have to bring these other truths to bear. It's the role of Job, the book, to correct that problem for us, to make sure that we understand we don't ever then get to blame someone because they suffer in their life. Well, surely you did something wrong, Job's friends tell him. You must have, or this wouldn't happen to you. I mean, that's how the world works. It's how God works. It's how the universe works. You wouldn't be suffering this if you hadn't done something wrong to begin with. And Job comes as the balance. And in the midst of that, we have these words from God, which must feel overwhelming to Job, because he's bringing to bear all the hurt that he has in his life. What about when bad things happen to good people? How do we deal with that? Job's friends wanted to find blame. They wanted to say, well, you must have done something that you're not willing to tell us about. And makes sense, if you want to draw the conclusion, somewhere there has to be the case. But that's not the case. And when we find Job at this point, he has taken on all he can bear. It is to the point where he cannot bear any more suffering in his life. Everything's been taken from him. Family, home, everything in his life. Everything but his life. He's at the point of breaking. And yet, it's there that we find him. And Job has, like many of us in his life, he's reached his end. We've gotten to the place where we're not sure how we make it any further. How is it that we can go on one more step, whenever it feels so overwhelming? I think that when we face such suffering in our lives, we can look 2 ways. And one is to zoom in, and the other is to zoom out. And we in our culture have a tendency to want to zoom in very closely. Now, This is a picture of a place that's up, I don't know, maybe 2 miles from Colorado, 2 miles from New Mexico. I mean, it's right up there in the very corner of our panhandle, the state of Oklahoma. In fact, if you were to, it's delaying on me, and so there we go. If you look in that, I mean, it's barely even on this picture, north of Felt and Kenton, in the very end of the panhandle. And there is a place where in Oklahoma you can actually find dinosaur tracks. Can you see those now? It's just a little dirt road off of the highway, which is another dirt road basically at that point. And you get out there, and if you're willing to look and take a broom with you, you can find where these steps of a dinosaur walked across the earth millions of years ago. It's amazing to think about. Whenever I was ordained to be a pastor, we have at that kind of a two-step ordination. Whenever you're first ordained and assigned to a church, I was ordained as a deacon. We changed the system a little now, but you're basically you're on probation for a couple of years. We're going to give you, in the early days, they called it on trial. You were accepted on trial. How would you like that? So they changed it to probation, which now they've changed it to residency. They've made it really nice. And for those who are coming in, they're on residency. We didn't feel like we were on residency. It sometimes felt a little more like on trial. But then after 2 years, you go back through with ordination and all the exams again and interviews and all that stuff, and you meet with them, and then if you're approved, you're ordained as an elder. And Craig Stinson was a close friend of mine, and he had served out in Boise City, and I had asked him to be one of those. You get to ask 2 people to lay hands on you at your ordination. And I asked him to be one of those. And kind of as a gift. Most people wouldn't think going out to the panhandle was a gift. He took me out to the panhandle, and we went chasing dinosaurs. And we found the dinosaur footprints that were there, and of a creature that lived so long ago. And it was kind of an amazing thing. We went out and spent some time there. The creature actually, this shows you a nice, up close footprint, was something that walked across there. You could even see a bulge. It must have been not in a hurry, just walking slow. You can see the bulge of how the mud pushed out when it walked across there. And as it did, just meandering its way, 150 million years ago. Can you imagine? I mean, I can't imagine 1 million. Much less 150 million. And it traveled across there that day, leaving its print, and then getting covered up in just the right way so that now, all these years later, can walk across there and see it, touch it, feel it, that it's actually there. It's an amazing thing, this rock that hardened and gave witness to its having been there so long ago. Whenever we face difficulty in our lives, sometimes we draw close and we zoom in and we focus on the real suffering and pain that's there. You ever notice the stories on the news? It'll tell us, we'll watch the news, someone was shot, someone this and that, all these things, and then they'll take one story and they'll zoom in on that story. One person, maybe not as much suffering as one of the other pieces that we just went over, but they'll send us into the story deeper to learn more about the person's life, to know more about the circumstances that are in it. And we learn, and in a sense, it helps us identify with all those who had dealt with difficulty in the news stories, but this is the one that they've latched onto and we get drawn into to know more about it, to tell the story of that suffering, of the difficulty that that person has gone through. Sometimes we do that, and when we do, we're able to examine what we're dealing with in our lives, and loss of a loved one, in such a way that we're enabled to move through the grief process to a place that leaves us with a better understanding of what we've gone through and God's presence with us. It's one way of understanding human suffering. The second way is to take a step back. In this first way, we look closer at it. And I think here is part of the problem. It becomes a helpful thing, but it can be a problem for us as well. We live at the end, I think, of a long period of self-examination as a culture. From the Renaissance, moving from seeing the world that was focused and that God was at the center of the universe, soon we realized that that's not the case. We thought the earth was the center of the universe where God had created us, and we realized that we're no longer that, and that the world is spinning around one small sun with billions of them out there, and we are so small in relationship to that. But what we now see, then Renaissance began to focus on that in such a way. Let me walk you just briefly through the history of philosophy. So now, because the world no longer looks the way we thought it was at the center, we have to figure out a new reason to believe in God. And so Descartes tries to found what was we can prove God's existence on. And he starts doubting everything. And he says, in a sense, doubts away. If we can doubt everything away, then what is still left? And he comes to the point of saying, well, there's thinking. What I know, if even nothing else exists, there's thinking. And so he comes up with this phrase, which many of us know, I think, therefore I am. And that becomes the foundation to begin. Human thinking is at the center now of proving the existence of God in the world. Well, what later Immanuel Kant points out is that you can say there's thinking, but ultimately that doesn't prove that there's a thinker. And so he begins to push on this. And he says, when you look at how we live in the world, there is a moral foundation to it all. There is a moral a priori concept, he says. It's a part of our life that pushes us to do the right thing, to do that which is our duty, the good. And that is what we can found our belief on God. Because if this world was not a moral world, and there was not this moral principle, then there certainly would not be a moral God who created it. But since there is a God with a moral principle that we can trust in and believe in. But we get pushed further and further away from seeing the world in that perspective. Then later, Schleiermacher comes through and says you can't do it on the moral ground. It's on the religious experience that we have that we can prove God's existence. Finally, it moves out to the point where we can't prove God exists at all, which is actually the truth of the matter. I mean, there's no way to prove God exists. We can say we have religious experience that we feel is God in our life. We can have faith and trust and belief in God. I think that ultimately is what we have. And maybe that's a whole lot riskier thing, a whole lot more valuable thing, to live with such faith where we cannot prove and where we cannot know, and yet to trust and to step out and to experience God being there for us anyway. That whenever we have that kind of faith, it's not built up on some premise that is outside, but it's something we can know most deeply within ourselves. Now, I'm getting to the point. You may think we've lost track, but this really is working on a point to get for the message today. While we were out there, we had examined all the footprints. While he had served as a pastor at Boise City, had gone through a divorce before he went out there. He was not interested in dating anyone after that. He spent 5 years at Boise City, and he was just working as a pastor And in his free time, he got really interested in paleontology. And so he found that there was this red kind of clay mud that you could see, or not red, it was green, that you could see just in a layer, different parts of the mesas around Black Mesa that you could see. And he began digging in them. And he actually uncovered, right before he moved from there to Norman, a creature, a phytosaur, about 10 feet long. Basically, it's kind of a pre-alligator type of creature. And had discovered it, had excavated it. It's now in the Norman Museum, probably in a drawer somewhere. And so he took me out there, and we just spent about an hour or so digging in this clay. And I found several teeth, and that was the easy thing to find because it's a marshy little area and back millions of years ago. And in this clay, you could move through, and I found these small pieces of a bone. Clearly, that was a bone of a creature that had lived in that place, had died there, and in the settlement and the sediment around it had all kind of preserved it to this day. And I still have those bones. I kept them. And what I learned is this was from a creature that lived 225 million years ago. Can you imagine that, to hold the bone of something that lived 200 million years before you? I think it must have been a little bit like what Job felt when God said, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Were you there when all the stars and the heavenly beings sang praise as I created the very first sunrise?" Can you imagine? Where were you when all this was going on? Can you lay the compass and measure? Can you take the tape measure out and measure the circumference of the earth? No, but I can. I was the one who was there. We talked about one way to examine the story is by going deeper and deeper and deeper. The other is to back away further and further, to the point where you see how small our lives are. We are a speck in 225 million years. From that creature to my digging up that bone today. That long. How many people had lived on the earth in that time? How much difficulty had they gone through? Ups and downs. Maybe what I feel as this overwhelming struggle in my life is not so big in this big thing after all. One way that we can easily move from being self-absorbed with our own difficulty is to back further away from it and to see how many people have gone through exactly the same things that we have and that we're not unique in that way. This God who was is so beyond us, so much bigger. And it's an interesting thing. Maybe some of our own sorrow can just melt away in the context of knowing that that is the world in which we live. The sad truth is, even 100 years from now, there won't be anyone who really remembers that we even were here. Can you think about that? I mean, there might be someone, if we really wanted to push it 150 years, but basically in 100 years, no one will know that we were here. I look at the list of pastors who are here and who serve this church, and I think I have a pretty good corporate memory of United Methodism in Oklahoma. And I can go through there, and all the most recent ones I know, but then I start running into folks I've never heard of before. I don't know their stories. I don't know a thing about them. You maybe know some of them, but when we get deep into that list, you don't know them anymore. Maybe you know a story that, well, I remember mom or dad said something about this particular pastor who happened to be here. The truth is, 100 years from now, no one will know we even existed. How in the world then can this struggle that we experience in this moment be so big? Maybe it allows us to see we can step back. When God speaks to us out of the whirlwind, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth? Maybe it allows us to step back just enough to see that there's an incredible beauty in this world that we are privileged to be connected to. Maybe it allows that to just melt away, and all we see is the good that remains present. We can feel so small, but the truth is, our smallness is that we are grasped in the hands of a loving God who is so big, and yet willing to love us and care for us anyway. A loving God that is so enormous, beyond our understanding, and yet takes our hand and loves us anyway. The God who created my life, your life, this universe in which we live, loves even you and me and cares for us. It's pretty awesome. Maybe we can see just how important we are if we back away and see how small we are first. Amen.